Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Zara Seidler.
Earlier this month, a group of white South African refugees arrived in the US after an executive order by President Donald Trump. Trump claims the group are being targeted as victims of, quote, racial discrimination and has therefore extended refugee protection to the group. In today's podcast, we'll explain the story behind the headlines and what you need to know about the Trump administration's decision to grant refugee status to white South Africans.
Lucy, this is a story that has been flying around now for a few weeks. And then last week, we published a video to TDA's Instagram showing US President Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa arguing in the White House.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of context.
Yeah.
Can you, start by just explaining more about what Trump specifically is alleging is happening in South Africa today?
Yes. Basically, as soon as he came to office for the second time earlier this year, US President Donald Trump began making public statements and issuing official guidance claiming that white South Africans, specifically the ethnic group called Afrikaners, were having their land stolen by the government. Mm-hmm. He said these people would be granted refugee status in the US because they were the, quote, victims of unjust racial discrimination. Then, a couple of months down the track, so earlier this month, 59 white South Africans arrived in the US as refugees. They're going to be resettled around the country. It's a very serious allegation to lay against South Africa, against any country, but I think particularly against South Africa, that a group of people are being so racially discriminated against that we need to extract them, right?
And so why is that such a loaded, accusation for a country like South Africa?
Unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer. I wish I did. In order to understand that, we need to take a step back in time. So the Netherlands began colonizing the region we now know as South Africa in the 1650s through the Dutch East India Company. You might remember from a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Kashmir, how the British had the British East India Company. Same deal, but in the Netherlands. A very, very powerful company, effectively a state unto itself with its own kind of representatives and just being like incredibly powerful through trade. Through colonization, through slavery, through farming, the Dutch took control of the region from its southern tip, the Cape of Good Hope. Over time, these Dutch colonizers developed into an ethnic minority in the region called Afrikaners with their own language that was a dialect of Dutch that then became its own language called Afrikaans.
Yeah.
They also fought wars with the British for control of the land during this time. Then fast forward again to 1914 when the Afrikaners founded their own political party, the National Party. It became a very powerful force. It was aligned against Black South Africans and against the British, their long-term enemies in the war for resources and for land. Then in 1948, the National Party took power by itself, not in a coalition, and it enacted the policy known as apartheid.
Okay, and apartheid is obviously a huge moment in history, in world history, global history. Yeah. For anyone who's perhaps less familiar with this history, can you just give a bit of a refresher? What was apartheid?
Broad brushstrokes, from 1948 to 1994, South Africa separated people based on their race. The government passed laws either limiting or outright banning movements, education, jobs, pay, and marriage for non-white people. This ended after decades of peaceful and violent struggles when the party, the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, won the country's first modern elections. Since then, things have not been completely peaceful in South Africa. I think it's easy to understand that when you end a system that long-standing and that kind of corrosive, you don't just like snap your fingers and everything becomes multicultural harmony. The crime rate is fairly high, particularly the murder rate, and the economy has definitely struggled in South Africa. The latest data, though, that I looked at this week shows that the rate of murders is down in all but one region of South Africa. And then just a final note on the kind of state of the country in its modern era. White South Africans make up around 10% or less than 10% of the population, but white farmers own around 3/4 of the country's land.
And so you've spoken there of land,
Yeah.
and land is at the centre of the claims that Donald Trump is now making about modern day South Africa. Specifically, he's claiming, as you said, that white South Africans are being targeted for murder and are having their land stolen.
Yeah.
Where is this claim from US President Donald Trump coming from? What is the basis for this claim?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
The land theft aspect is easier to explain, so I'll start there. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa signed a bill into law in January which allows the government to redistribute land deemed in the public interest. It includes provisions enabling land distribution without compensation in very specific cases, such as when it's deemed to be abandoned. Following that announcement, Trump accused South Africa of, quote, confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. And then soon after that, he signed his executive order allowing white South Africans to apply for refugee status. To the other point, as I said, the murder rate in South Africa is high. It is true that some white farmers make up this statistic. We have official data that shows this. However, in February, a South African court ruled that claims of genocide against white South Africans were, quote, clearly imagined and not real. Then, over the weekend, we heard from South African Police Minister Senzo Mchunu, who released new crime data and specifically went out of his way to deny Trump's claims.
It is claimed there is white genocide in South Africa. And as evidence, a lot of material has been put into circulation all over social media, including in the White House in the USA. Now we have respect for the United States of America. We have respect for the people of the United States, and we have respect for the President of the United States, President Donald Trump. But we have no respect for his genocide story.
So the minister said he wasn't going to deny that crime levels were high, and he did say there had been 6 attacks on people on farms in rural areas in the first 3 months of this year, but that of the 6 attacks, only 1 victim was white.
Okay, and so if those are the statistics, where is this idea coming from?
Yeah, so Reuters has reported that the idea of a, quote-unquote, white genocide of farmers in South Africa originated as a conspiracy theory in far-right chat rooms. Another place it has popped up this month is in text generated by an AI chatbot on the social media platform X, which is owned by Elon Musk, who is himself white and from South Africa. I'll say X has called that randomly generated text an unauthorized modification that's being fixed. However, Musk has publicly suggested that the current government of South Africa is perpetrating a genocide against white people, and he is also a close advisor of Donald Trump and was in the room when Trump raised these allegations with Cyril Ramaphosa.
I want to circle back to this idea of Donald Trump providing refugee status for these white South Africans to enter the US, because so much of what we've read and seen about Donald Trump's administration and their immigration policy has been about deporting people out of the country.
Yeah.
How can we understand this in the context of the Trump administration and Donald Trump's immigration policy?
Yeah, it is definitely different to the other things that he has done or has overseen. So you might remember that on his first day in office, he signed a bunch of executive orders, which are official actions that the president can take that circumvent the need to go through the Congress. And one of those things was pausing the country's refugee program indefinitely.
Yeah.
But then he has also opened it up to this specific group. And he's also overseen the deportation and imprisonment of legal migrants and ended programs that allowed people without official documentation to live and work in the US. So it certainly stands in contrast to the remainder of his immigration policy, that this very select group, so select that it's fewer than 60 people so far, have been allowed to come in on this refugee program. It's certainly interesting to see how that squares with the rest of his documented policy. I guess it remains also to be seen how many more people will be given this opportunity to come to the US, and given that they've come, I suppose, from rural South African farming communities, what their life is going to look like once they're settled in the US.
Lucy, thank you so much for explaining the story behind the headlines that I know so many of our audience will have seen. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We'll be back as usual with the headlines later this afternoon, but until then, have a great day.